Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum for our Summer Survivor and Second Generation Speaker Series for 2020. Before I introduce to you our speaker for today, I wanted to thank our sponsor for the Summer Survivor Speaker Series, Ernst & Young, LLP, and I also wanted to thank our community partners for this series, Avance North Texas, Communities Foundation of Texas, Educational First Steps, Faith Forward Dallas, International Rescue Committee in Dallas, Legacy Senior Communities, Reach of Dallas, SMU Human Rights Program, and Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission. Their assistance makes programs like these possible, and we're very, very grateful to them. Today, you will be hearing Ron Schwarz, a second-generation survivor, tell the story of his father, Charles's experiences during the Holocaust. His father, Charles, was on a children's transport to France and was also a hidden child in France amongst his other experiences. And Ron will be sharing those details with you today. At the end of our talk, which will last about 45 minutes, you are welcome to ask questions which Ron will answer for you. Those questions can be submitted at the bottom of your Zoom screen in the Q&A section or even in the chat section, and we will be able to feed all of those questions through to Ron. So we hope you enjoy today's session, and I give you to Ron Schwarz. Ron?
Well, thank you, Sarah. As Sarah told you, my name is Ron Schwarz, and I'm going to tell you a story today. It's a true story about my father and what it was like for him growing up as a Jew in Germany in the 1930s, and also a bit about my grandparents who endured the Nazis and dealt with a lot of the decrees that the Nazis passed. I'd like to give a little shout out to the Dallas Holocaust Museum for stimulating a lot of the research that I've done into my father and for helping me put together this presentation. The story for me begins in Ludwigshafen, Germany in 1925. Ludwigshafen is about 60 miles south of Frankfurt. And during the 1920s, the mid-20s, Ludwigshafen is it's a growing city. It's becoming an important industrial center of Germany. Lots of young people are moving there. There's a Jewish population at the time of about 1,400 people. Not huge, but large enough to have a synagogue. You can see from the pictures, the top right and top left, that's actually a picture of the synagogue in Ludwigshafen from the 1920s. In March 1925, my grandmother got married to a man named Carl Sidlin. Carl owned a watchmaker shop, a jewelry store, which, from everything I can tell, it was a pretty thriving business. What you see here on the top left is it's a picture of the street that the jewelry store was on. And I don't know if you can see on the right, there's a little clock on the outside of the building. And that actually is the jewelry store from the 1920s. And across the street from that is the apartment building where my grandparents, where they lived. In the middle is actually an invoice from the jewelry store. It's actually signed by Carl Sidlin. And on the top right is the marriage certificate of my grandmother to Carl. And if you look at the right side of that, there's There's some notations there with a blue circle around it, and I want you to remember that because I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. About 10 months later, in January of 1926, my father was born. About 7 days after my father was born, my grandmother's still in the hospital, in the maternity ward. An ex-employee walks into the jewelry store to talk to my grandfather, Carl Sidlin, about coming back to work. They have a little discussion and they agree that he can start work the following week. He then took out a gun and shot Carl Sidlin in the chest, killing him. There were two other employees in the jewelry store. He shot them as well, but they were superficial wounds. They both survived. And then he turned the gun on himself and he killed himself. This is the newspaper from the next day, and on the top right is the article about it. This is a blow-up of that article, and what it says is, a terrible bloody act, 2 dead and 2 injured on Prinzregentenstrasse. Prinzregentenstrasse is the name of the street they lived on. And the article goes on to explain what happened, and because two of the 2 employees that were shot survived, there were eyewitness accounts to everything, to the conversation. I've been through this article a lot of times looking for any hint of anti-Semitism, but I really didn't find anything of that. The article really focuses on the mental health of the killer. These were obituaries that were published in the local newspaper, and also Carl's death certificate. I think he was a well-known and popular guy in town. The newspaper articles talk about hundreds of people following the coffin to the cemetery. Now, imagine my poor grandmother. She's 25 years old. Her husband was just murdered. She's only been married 10 months. And she's got a newborn son, and now she's got a jewelry store to run. But life goes on. 3 years later, my grandmother got remarried to a man named Oscar Schwarz. That's why I'm a Schwarz. We think it was kind of an arranged marriage. At least that's what my mother always told me. And Oscar adopted my father, and I guess he got the jewelry store also because he ended up running the jewelry store. On the top left is their marriage certificate, my grandmother to Oscar, and again, you see those notations on the right side of the marriage certificate, and again, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. The picture on the right is a picture of my dad. I don't know how old he was there, maybe about 10 years old. And in the middle is an address book from the 1930s in Ludwigshafen, and you can you see this better. That's actually a blow up of it. You can see that's my grandparents. That's Oscar. I think you can see it says KFM, that's Kaufmann, which means businessman, and it's got the address, Prinzregentenstrasse 65, and that was the apartment building where they lived. So things are actually okay in Germany in the middle 20s. They're recovering from World War I, and Germany's exporting a lot of products. Economic life is really pretty good, and things are fine until they're not so fine anymore. Let's listen to my father talk a little bit about going to school and some of the anti-Semitism there. So, okay, I was just told that you guys didn't hear any sound, so they're gonna try to fix that and do that again.
In the, I don't know about the first year, but certainly in the second, third year, and beyond that, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the school. In other words, the kids called me Saujude, which is German for Jew pig. And I remember that the teacher really didn't take any action. I mean, he was not openly antagonistic towards me, but he certainly made no attempt whatsoever to curb the other children.
So I think what's important there is that even before Hitler came to power, there's already anti-Semitism and feelings of antagonism towards Jews in Germany. By the way, that's my dad. He's a cute little old man, isn't he? And I know y'all think that he has an accent, but I want to tell you that you're all wrong. He doesn't. I don't hear it, and there's nothing that you can tell me to convince me that he does. In 1933, Hitler comes to power. He gets appointed Chancellor of Germany. He really quickly consolidates power and assumes a dictatorial role. I think it's important to note with Hitler that he came to power through completely legal means. There was no coup d'etat. There was no military takeover. And I think to understand the appeal of Hitler, I mean, they teach courses on this. I'm going to give you the 15-second overview. By 1933, Germany is in economic freefall. The Depression in the United States in 1929, when that happened, the U.S., who had loaned a lot of money to Germany to rebuild after World War I, wanted the loans repaid. Germany they didn't have the money. They just started printing money to repay the U.S. So Germany is going through a period of hyperinflation. The currency is being devalued, and there is a lot of unemployment. Hitler comes in, and Hitler says, I'm going to rebuild the military. I'm going to rebuild that infrastructure. Everybody's going to have a job. I'm going to give everybody a job. And by the way, the reason that things are so bad is because of the Jews. What they have, the reason they have what they have is because you don't have it. And so he really he didn't start blaming them. He had been blaming the Jews since the end of World War I. But anyway, that is part of the appeal of Hitler. In 1935, Germany passes the Nuremberg laws. The Nuremberg laws were for the protection of German blood and honor. And they imposed all kinds of restrictions on Jews, both socially and economically. They stripped German citizenship from Jews. So if you were a Jew born in Germany and raised in Germany, you were no longer German. You were stateless. There was no intermarrying between Germans and Jews. Non-Jewish women couldn't work in a Jewish home. Jewish officers were expelled from the army. There was a whole list of restrictions that this placed on Jews, and the Nuremberg laws really had a crippling effect, both socially and economically, on the Jews in Germany. And let's now listen to my dad talk about the Nuremberg laws. Oh, before we do that, you can see up there that article from the New York Times from 1935 about Reich puts laws on Jews in force. Trade is untouched. I put that in there. I want you to realize that this is happening in Germany, but there is international knowledge about what is happening there. Okay, so let's listen to my dad talk about the Nuremberg laws.
In the meantime, additional decrees came out limiting the movement of Jews. For instance, I recall we couldn't go anymore to the park where we used to go because the benches in the park had signs, no Jews are allowed. It was difficult to travel because hotels had signs, no dogs and no Jews. As a side comment, after World War II, the Germans liked to go to the shore in Holland, and since the Dutch had suffered quite a bit under the German occupation, the hotels on the shore in Holland had signs, no dogs and no Germans.
Yeah, you can tell my father loved that story. He used to tell me that story when I was growing up, but you could hear him kind of chuckle at the end. I want to know when he first started that little video piece, he said additional decrees were coming all the time. In all, the Nazis passed something like 400 decrees restricting Jewish life in Germany, and that was just at the national level. In addition to that, local municipalities and regional governments passed their own decrees in addition to those. So they really legislated. They legislated the Jews out of Germany in addition to to murdering them. My grandparents, so they lived across the street from the jewelry store, but they also owned this other apartment building. It was a 4-story building, and they rented out each of the stories. And at the beginning of 1938, and actually January of 1938, they sold it, and they sold it under duress, this building. And to sell something under duress means they didn't really want to sell it, but they sold it because if they didn't sell it, it would have been taken from them, and they ended up selling it at a bargain basement price. What you're looking at here is the actual sales contract when they sold the building. And it was sold to the Hodge family, H-A-G-E, you probably can't read that. And it was sold for 34,000 Reichsmarks. I've been trying to find out what it really was worth, what the true market value was, but I've really not been able to do that. In the middle of 1938, the Nazis passed a law. It's called the Law on the Alteration of Names, of family and personal names. And what this was all Jews, all male Jews, had to change their names and add the name Israel to their name. So my grandfather, instead of just being Oscar Schwarz, was now Oscar Israel Schwarz. And all female Jews had to add the name Sarah to their name. So my grandmother was Therese Schwarz. She was now Therese Sarah Schwarz. 2 reasons to do this. One, it identifies unmistakably everybody as a Jew. If you say you're Israel or Sarah, then you're known to be a Jew. And it also has a kind of dehumanizing effect, right? You no longer have a unique identity. All men are Israel and all women are Sarah. So it was part of that dehumanizing process that the Nazis went through. What you see on the right is the marriage certificate of my grandparents. And remember I told you we saw those notations on the right. So those notations were actually added to the marriage certificate after the marriage in like 1938, 39. And what they did, the Nazis, they went through the civil register, and for all the men and all the women, they wrote on the side that this man is now named, he's added the word Israel, the name Israel, to his name. And for all women, she's now added the name Sarah to her name. And it's hard to read that German writing, but that is what it says. In the beginning of 1938, Kristallnacht happens. Kristallnacht was an event where Germans, this paramilitary group called the SA, the Brown Shirts, as well as civilians, they broke into Jewish homes, broke down the door, destroyed furniture, broke windows, completely destroyed the houses and apartments. They broke into businesses. They did the same thing. They broke shop windows of Jews. They burned down the synagogues in the country. You can see on the bottom left, that's the synagogue that I showed you in one of the first pictures. That's the same synagogue, and you can see smoke coming out of the synagogue. On the top left, there's you can see that newspaper. That's from the Dallas. The Dallas Morning News from, I think it's November 9th or 10th of 1938. And there's a story about Kristallnacht. Again, I think it's important to note that the whole world had knowledge about what was happening in Germany. Let's listen to my father talk a little bit about Kristallnacht.
We were spared. They never came to our apartment, nor did they destroy the store. And they told my parents later on that since we had a jewelry store and there was a lot of gold in there, that they considered that to be state property, and therefore it was not their intention of destroying it. They picked up my dad, and for several days we didn't really know where he had been sent to. My mother went to the Gestapo office every day to find out what the status was, and I gather they were civil to her, and she finally found out that he had been sent to Dachau.
So the Nazis actually arrested about 30,000 Jews during Kristallnacht, and they sent them to concentration camps. As my dad said, my grandfather was sent to Dachau. This comes from the Dachau archives, showing the record of my grandfather's arrest. And a couple of things that I think are important to see here. One, his name they list as Abraham Schwarz. Abraham was actually his Hebrew name. It has the dates of his entry into the camp and his release. He was there for about 5 or 6 weeks and got released on December 20th of 1938. And notice now down at the bottom, for nationality, staatenlos, that means stateless. So they're not calling him a German. Remember, the Nuremberg laws took away their citizenship. So he is stateless. At the beginning of 1939, the Nazis create a census of Jews. This one is their census from Ludwigshafen, and it's from January 1st, 1939. This is where my grandparents and my father are listed, and you can see over on the right, In the last column, it's an abbreviation for staatenlos, stateless. And the second column that says NA, that means they're not Aryan. So you could either be an Aryan, you could be not Aryan, or you could be Michtling, which was mixed. So if you had a mixed marriage between an Aryan and a non-Aryan, the kids would have that status of M. Why did the Nazis create a census? Well, A, they're counting Jews. Why, and why do they want to know who the Jews are and where they are? They're already thinking about deportations in 1939, and they're creating this list. Right after Kristallnacht, the Nazis pass another decree. It's a law on the exclusion of Jews from German economic life. So Jews, they're no longer allowed to own stores. They can't sell goods. They can't operate any establishment of any kind. They can't carry on a trade. The point here is, before the Nazis murdered the Jews, they impoverished them. They disallowed them from carrying on business. My grandfather gets this letter. It's dated February 8th, 1939. And you can see the date there. In Europe, they write dates day, month, year, as opposed to how we do it, month, day, year. And this letter is from basically the city, the mayor's office, the equivalent of the mayor's office in Ludwigshafen. And the subject line says elimination of Jews from German economic life. And the letter goes on to say that the jewelry store, the watchmaker shop, has to be dissolved. And they order him to do an inventory of all the goods in the store. Notice at the top, the letter is addressed to Oscar Israel Schwarz, right, his new name. The two sheets on the bottom left are the actual inventory my grandfather did. There's about a 15-page inventory listing every item in the store and the value. And my grandfather's value of the inventory is roughly 9,900 Reichsmarks. And notice he signed it Oscar Israel Schwarz with his new name. Well, the Nazis aren't going to believe the Jews, so they bring in their own appraiser. At the top left, you can see that Richard Albrecht, and he's a Nazi, and he goes through my grandfather's inventory and says, no, this isn't right, and he says the correct value of the inventory is 6,500 Reichsmarks. And you'll notice at the bottom, it's signed Heil Hitler. And I want to tell you, I have literally hundreds of pages of documents. I've probably read through thousands of pages in different archives in Europe. And this upset me more than anything. Obviously, he would write Heil Hitler. He was a Nazi. That's what they did. But this just made it really real for me. Like, I had a really, really visceral reaction to this when I first saw it. Anyway, my grandfather has to dissolve the store. They find a buyer. There's this guy Karl Schenk on the right, that wants to buy the store. First, the Nazis say, no, you can't, you're not qualified, and then they finally allowed him to do it. He and my grandfather agree on a price of 7,500 Reichsmarks, and this is the sales contract, selling the store to Karl Schenk for the 7,500 Reichsmarks. This paragraph that's exploded on the right is very interesting, because it says that the money is to be paid into a blocked account at Deutschen Bank. What does that mean? That means that this guy, Karl Schenk, paid the money, it went into this account, but my grandfather never got it. The Nazis took it. And this was actually pretty typical with Jewish businesses that were seized in Europe, that the Jews never got the money. So I want you to get a sense of the seriousness that's kind of escalating here. like this starts out, you remember my father talked about going to school and being called Jew pig. So it starts with name calling. Then Nuremberg laws happen and they start restricting life of Jews. Then Kristallnacht happens and there's now physical violence and incarceration of Jews. And then they start seizing Jewish assets. So it's getting more and more serious. While my grandparents are dealing with the sale of the store, it took about 2 months from the beginning of February to the end of March. Arrangements are being made for my father to be sent out of the country to Paris. He comes home from school one day, and he's told that tomorrow he's going to Paris. He's getting on the train. He's going alone. He's 13 years old. He doesn't speak the language. He doesn't speak any French. And but he goes and he's sent initially to a place called Château de la Guette, which is just outside of Paris. Let's listen to my dad talk about leaving Germany.
1939, I was taken to the railroad station, and with a group of 100, maybe 200 kids, we took the train for Paris. When we got to Paris, originally, we were sent to the Rothschild hospital because apparently they had enough rooms and beds available to accommodate everybody, and there we were sorted out and sent to various children hostels. I was sent to a place called Château de la Guette, which was about 50 miles east of Paris. It was, I don't know whether it was owned by the Rothschilds or whether they had rented it, but we were 136 kids, all from Germany and Austria. We were very well taken care of there. In other words, we had nice accommodations. We were adequately fed.
So think about what this must have been like for him at 13. I mean, he's going to a foreign country. He doesn't speak the language. He doesn't know if he's ever going to see his parents again. I mean, he had to be terrified. I know that doesn't come through in the video as he's talking about it, but he just had to be. And what must this have been like for his parents, you know, to put him on that train? They didn't know if they would ever get out of Germany and if they would ever see him again. And by the way, just a spoiler alert, my grandparents did get out of Germany about 2 months later, and they made their way to England, where they lived during the war. These are class schedules from La Guette, and I have this in here only to point out that you can see on the bottom left, Activité en plein air is outdoor activities. They did that for 2 hours. And then under that, couture and ménage is sewing and housework. And what they're doing, the outdoor activities, they're getting these kids in good physical shape. And with the sewing and the housework, they're teaching them skills for survival, because they don't know at what point these kids are going to be on the run and are going to have to fend for themselves. So they start doing that at La Guette. In May of 1940, Germany invades France. They actually invaded all Western Europe, Scandinavia, Belgium, the Netherlands. And if you look at that map on the top right, that map of France, you can see that white line. France is actually divided into two zones by that demarcation line. North of that white line was occupied by the German. South of that white line is unoccupied France, although it is a collaborative government, the Vichy government. My father, at this time, he was sent to a different school from Laguette, and the Germans are coming, and the director of the school decides Paris isn't safe for these kids, and he owned an estate in a town called Poitiers, and he's going to take the kids to Poitiers. That picture in the middle on the top is a picture of a train station in France, in Paris, of people trying to get out, right? Nobody wanted to live under German occupation. Let's listen to my dad talk about leaving France and going to Poitiers.
The director of the school, or the owner of the school, owned an estate near Poitiers, which is sort of halfway between Paris and Bordeaux, and when the Germans were basically at the doors of Paris, he decided to evacuate the whole school to Poitiers, and we took the train from Paris to Poitiers. It was quite an experience because everybody was fleeing, and the trains were sort of crowded. I mean, there was barely room to stand, and they were slow, but we finally made it.
So the problem with Poitiers is still in the occupied part of France. So there was really not much difference between being there or being in Paris. So they only stayed in Poitiers for a couple of months, and then the director took the kids back to Paris. Once they got back to Paris, the kids then got dispersed to different facilities and children's homes around France, and my father got sent to La Bourboule. La Bourboule was more desirable because it was in the unoccupied part of France. My father doesn't know how they got permission and permits to get there. He assumed they were forged. A lot of people, right? Everyone wanted to travel to the unoccupied part of France. The Germans, they didn't make it easy. And a lot of people were shot at trying to cross that demarcation line. Not my father, but people were. So this was a risky journey. They get to La Bourboule. It's 1941, and life was difficult there. Let's listen to my dad talk about life in La Bourboule in the winter.
It was a very harsh winter for us. Food was severely rationed, and the things that were not rationed, just like vegetables, just were not available. Then it was very cold and snowy, lots of snow, very cold in winter, and there wasn't enough coal or wood to heat the place. We had minimal heating in the dining room and in the bedroom and in the classrooms. We had zero heat in the bedrooms, and of course we were constantly hungry. There just wasn't enough to eat. One of the people we were 5 or 6 in each bedroom. One of the people in our room was a very tall and strong guy, And I remember he once went during the day, in the evening rather, into the mountains and into one of the barns, and he stole a 50 kilo bag of oats that were kept there to feed the horses. And he brought it back, and we were eating the oats, which were horse meal, and I remember I had a shoebox, and I filled that with oats, and I kept it under my bed.
Horse meal. They ate horse meal. I mean, you did what you had to do to survive, right? My father stayed in Bourboule for about 6 months, and then he moved again. I'm not going to tell you all the places that he was in France. I think you get the idea. But he lived in 10 different places, 10 different facilities in France. He was moved around a lot. And the people that moved around had a better chance of surviving. The people that stayed in one place had less of a chance of surviving. Probably the most famous example of that is Anne Frank. So while my father is in France, he doesn't really talk about this. I don't know if he's going on, but let me tell you what's going on in France. So my father's going to escape to Switzerland, and I'm going to tell you about that. But while he's that's not until October of 1942. What is happening in France while he's there, in the middle of 1941, they start rounding up Jews and arresting them. And in March of 1942, they start deporting the Jews mostly to Auschwitz. And you can see, this is a table, these are the first 20 deportation convoys from France. And you can see they're all about 1,000 people each, starting in March of 1942. And again, you can see these all went to Auschwitz. Not everyone went to Auschwitz, but most of them did. So this is happening for a year and a half while my father is there. So he's definitely in hiding while he's in France. I don't know. He clearly doesn't talk about this in the video. I don't know how much he knew about this, but clearly he must have known that there was some danger. I mean, he knew he left Germany because of danger. And this is a listing of, one page of the listing of all the Laguette kids. And you can see here on this, I think, this lists 5 or 6 of them that were deported in 1942. In all, 10 Laguette kids were deported, unfortunately, and just one of those 10 survived. By the end of 1942, it's determined that France isn't safe for these kids anymore, and they're going to help them escape to Switzerland. My father and 3 friends with counterfeit papers, they get on a train for Annemasse. Annemasse is a town, it's in France, but it's on the border with Switzerland. It's about 6 or 7 miles from Geneva. And they got on this train. My father said it was a really, really scary journey. They were on the train. There were soldiers checking your papers all the time. When they got to Annemasse, you couldn't get out of the train station without showing your papers. They're met at the train station by a man who took them to a safe house, and they hid out there till 2 or 3 in the morning, and then he took them to the Swiss border. They took off their shoes, they waded across a small creek, and on the other side of the creek, they were now in Switzerland. We're going to listen to my dad talk about entering Switzerland, but I want you to think about this train ride and this crossing into Switzerland. If they got caught, they'd either be shot or deported to Auschwitz. So this this was a really, really scary journey for them. Okay, so they're in Switzerland. They start walking. They're heading towards Geneva. They get picked up by a Swiss border guard. Let's listen to my father talk about this.
How we took off our shoes and socks and pulled up our pants, and we got across the barbed wire and that little river, and on the other hand we sat down, we put back our shoes and socks, and at that point that we were already in Switzerland, at the other side of the river was Switzerland. At that point we were caught by a Swiss border guard. As I said, there were 4 of us. He took us to a sort of entry post where we were asked our names and date of birth. We had nothing on us. In other words, no baggage, I mean just the clothes that we were wearing. We had 0 money, neither French nor Swiss. We had no papers whatsoever. So whatever information we gave them, they had to accept at face value. They asked for our date of birth, and 3 of us were born in 25 or 26, and 1 was born in 1927. And they announced that they would not keep children over the age of 16, and the boss asked one of the border guards to take us back to the border and to ship us back across the border into France. They kept the 4th one, who was born in 1927. He took us back to the border. Turn it off a second. So he took us back to the border and he said, this is France across that little river, and you need to go back. Geneva is in this direction, and I don't know what you're going to do when I'm on my way back. So we waited till he had gotten back, and then we headed towards Geneva.
I mean, can you imagine what it was like to go through this journey, this train ride to Annemasse, and then hear this captain tell them, you have to go back to France. Again, if they go back to France, they have nowhere to go. It's really a death sentence for them. And the Swiss soldier who really let them stay in France, we have a word for people like that, people that did decent things. We call them upstanders. And he's a fine example of an upstander. Okay, so really quickly, my father's in Switzerland now. He's safe. Switzerland is neutral. They're not in the war. But he's still a refugee. He's not a citizen of Switzerland. His life there, again, he's safe, but his life isn't easy. He's moved around a lot. He lives in about 7 different places in Switzerland. He can't go anywhere without getting the permission of the police. The administration of refugee children was handled under the police department. There are all these, he had these jobs at children's homes. He got hired mostly as a cook, which makes no sense if you knew my father. But he did, and in these jobs he had, they would pay him a small salary. He would get half of it, and the other half would go in an account for him, a bank account, and he had a right to the police to get permission to get those funds that were being put away for him. This is actually a letter from one of the facilities, the children's homes where he worked as a cook, and basically this letter says that it's a letter from the home to the police saying, yeah, this kid is here, but he can't work. He's anxious and his nerves are frayed from the experience he went through, and we want to keep him. We want permission to keep him because he's a nice kid, but he can't do the job. And the police allowed him to stay at a lower salary. Just some other documents from Switzerland. The top one is the notice of his refugee card that they sent him. The bottom left is a letter that my father wrote saying that he was French and not German. And the bottom right is a letter from the police to him. He had requested a reimbursement from this bank account, and this is a letter from them denying him the money. The war ends. It's 1945 now. My father spent about 3 years in Switzerland, moving around a lot. Like I told you, his parents escaped. They were in England. The war ends. He's 19 years old now. He hasn't seen his parents in 6 years, from starting at age 13. You would think he would have gone to England. He didn't. He went to Palestine. It was not yet Israel. He worked there on a kibbutz. He absolutely hated it. He said you couldn't own anything. His parents sent him airmail stamps to write letters to them. They confiscated them. It was a very, very, very socialist environment. But he stayed there for 9 months. And then he finally, at age 20, he goes to England to reunite with his parents. This is now 1946. He goes to England. He does reunite with his parents. He lives with them in England. He learns English. He didn't speak English at the time. He learns English. He gets a bunch of different jobs in England. And then 2 years later, 1948, my father came to New York. He got settled. He got an apartment in New York City. If you know New York City, it was in Washington Heights. And then after he got settled and got this apartment, my grandparents followed, and they all lived together in the apartment. My father met my mother in 1951. My mother was American. She was born in New York. My father's parents could not believe that he was not marrying a German, and my mother's parents couldn't believe that my mother was marrying a German. But they all learned to hate each other. No, actually, they got along fine. When my father came to New York, that's his immigration card on the bottom left, his naturalization card, and that's actually the ship manifest from Liverpool to New York when he came. So he gets married, and like exactly 9 months later, my brother's born. I was born 3 years after that, and my father made a great life for himself and for his family in the States. It's not changing. There we go. Just one really last thing. My grandparents, so they ended up suing the German government for restitution. They filed 2 lawsuits. One was against the German government. My grandfather wanted a pension for life from them for what he lost, and I believe he won that lawsuit. This is actually a copy of the lawsuit that he filed. I've been able to get that. They filed another lawsuit against the Hodges, that couple that bought the apartment building from them in 1938. And I don't know what happened with that lawsuit. I have someone in Germany that's helping me find out to see if we can get an answer to that. But it's actually interesting because that apartment building was destroyed during the war. It was bombed by the Allies. So when they filed this lawsuit against the Hodges, that building didn't exist anymore. And this is kind of what my father's life became with the family that he created. These are pictures of, on the top left, that's me at preparing for my bar mitzvah. In the middle at the top, that's my father holding my son as a newborn. And on the top right, those are my two kids. I think they're about 2 years old there. And on the bottom left, those are the same two kids kind of growing up. That's my daughter's law school graduation. And on the bottom right is his wedding picture, my son's wedding picture. And then the bottom and the center, that's just my dad and I. So that's all I have. Thank you very much. I think we have some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Ron. You're hearing the voice of Annie Black, Director of Programs and Volunteers. We do have a couple questions. The first one is, how did you come into possession of all your family's papers? How did you find all that documentation?
So I got the documentation really through different archives in Europe. I've got in touch with the city archives and really established a relationship with an archivist at the city archives in Ludwigshafen. And he was incredibly helpful, and I went there and I met him, and we went through a lot of documents, and he helped me pull together a lot of these documents. I have a lot of documents from Switzerland. I've only shown you a few of them, but I got those. They were just sitting in a Swiss archive that I found out about the archive just doing some research, and I contacted them, and they sent it to me. And then in France, the documents were really scattered all about, and I've just been able, by contacting different organizations, been able to get that. So, but it took some of it was done from here, and some of it just took a few trips to Europe.
We have another question. Obviously, your dad and the other children had a lot of help along the way in France and getting to Switzerland. In your research, have you found anything from those people? What inspired them to really risk their own lives to save the lives of these children?
So there were really two groups. One was when my father went to La Guette. La Guette was funded by the Rothschild family. They were a very wealthy French banking family that left France before the war, or some of them left before the war, and then some left during the war. But they left money behind and for facilities like La Guette. So that's how he was taken care of there. When La Guette closed when he was sent to La Bourboule. There's an organization called OSE, which stands for Oeuvre de Secours aux Enfants, and which basically means Children's Relief Organization, and it's for relief of to help Jewish children, and they were the ones who were really responsible for him and moving him around and keeping him safe. And again, these people are, just another great example of upstanders, for just the decent thing they did. They saved a lot of lives.
We have another person who wants to know what your grandfather and your father did for work after they came to the U.S.
So my grandfather continued, I don't know how much he worked. I think he did some watch repairs in his apartment in New York. And then my father was in the chemical business. He was a chemical importer. So he traveled a lot, and he would find producers of chemicals overseas that were needed here, and that was his business.
Do you think your dad, as an adult, was impacted emotionally, positive or negative, from his experience as a child? Did he ever talk about that?
It's a really interesting question. I don't think there's any doubt that my father was suffering from some kind of PTSD. He never talked about it because I don't think he really had that level of understanding and reflection. But I don't. But yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that he was affected. My dad was. He was kind of emotionally shut down, and he wasn't the kind of dad that would, get out there and, throw a baseball around with you and be all lovey and affectionate. That's just not who he was. He did kind of soften up a bit in later years, but yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that that he was deeply affected by this. And there's actually been a lot written by a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists that have looked into this on parenting styles of Holocaust survivors. And I mean, it definitely has an effect on their parenting issues and their ability to parent.
Did he share his story with you when you were a child, or did it take a long time to learn about what happened to him during the Holocaust?
My father was always willing to talk about it, and we used to go to my grandparents on Sunday for lunch, and in the car, he would tell me the story, and I couldn't hear it enough. I would say, wait, Dad, tell me that story again. Tell me that story again. I just, there was no such thing as too much. And I know there are a lot of survivors who refused to talk about their story and didn't tell their story and wouldn't. But my father wasn't like that. He was happy to talk about it.
Well, Ron, I think we'll end it here for today. Thank you all so much for being with us. Thank you to Ron for speaking. Thank you again to our sponsor, Ernst & Young, and our community partners. We hope to see everyone next week. Max Globin, one of our Holocaust survivor speakers, will be our speaker for next Tuesday. And we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.